Welcome, ladies and gentlemen. I hope you guys are all doing well. Today, my friends, we're back with our first look at Kislev here in Total War Warhammer 3. So in today's video, we're going to be taking a look at the entire Kislev roster, the Kislev faction passive. We'll also be looking at all the different spells from the new Lore of Ice, which of course the Ice Queen does indeed have. Pretty good stuff for sure. Quite exciting to see a very good lore magic that doesn't essentially rely on healing and summons and things like that. Has some really neat utility. But nonetheless, let us not waste any more time. Let's go ahead and jump right in and take a look here at the Kislev passive, which is called By Our Blood. So this is something you're going to be seeing faction-wide, and essentially it is enabled if your hit points are less than 50%. So it does have a duration. It's not like when you're below 50%, you're going to be getting this nonstop, right? You get it for a period of 35 seconds, and it really helps you bolster. And it makes the Kislev troops a lot tougher to break than, say, like the Empire and Bretonia, for example. 16 leadership is pretty substantial. You know, that's the difference between kind of a low leadership unit that's sitting in the 50s to something that's quite average to good leadership in the 60s and 70s. So very cool passive for sure. I think it's very much in flavor, and the text is quite funny as well. Kislevite warriors are inherently stronger than weak-hearted Empire men who know nothing of the hardship and strife of lives lived on the unforgiving steppes. Pretty cool stuff for sure. Yeah, very excited. I really like the Kislev aesthetic, but now let's go ahead and jump into the rest of the roster here. So another thing I want to look at before we go forward, because it is going to be pertinent for characters, I think this is a great change. And I think this is something that we are going to be seeing on single entities and characters in general, which I think is a good way to kind of nerf them, because I do feel in general, single entities and characters are a little bit overpowered in many respects. That's why in tournaments and competitive play, you pretty much have to have limitations on them and how many you can bring. So I think this is a really good step in the right direction. You'll notice here, if you take a look at the unit card here for Tsarina Katarin, she does have the wounds, not ability, but the wounds passive, or whatever you want to call it. Yeah, passive ability. So basically when characters get below 50% HP, they take a permanent debuff basically. They lose base weapon damage, they lose armor piercing weapon damage, and they also lose speed, which I think is quite cool. It looks like there's only one tier. You're also going to notice an improved UI. So if you look at the same unit card here, you're going to be able to see the passive abilities, the resistances are all kind of itemized a little bit. So you can go and look at characters a little bit more efficiently. Very cool stuff. And you can just do that by clicking on the little tooltip up at the top of that particular unit card. If you guys are looking to see the battle where I kind of look through that in a little bit more detail, you can check that out as well. So that is the wounds passive. And now we can begin with the Ice Queen herself. So taking a look at the Tsarina, obviously not rocking a whole lot of armor, but pretty good leadership and honestly pretty damn solid weapon strength for a caster lord. A lot of times these caster lords like Balthazar Gelt are rocking weapon strength in the, like the 300s, whether it be high or low. But she actually has 56 melee attack with Frostbite and is also rocking over 400 weapon strength. So she's certainly not a slouch in combat, but she has Lore of Ice and has a couple items which we'll be taking a look at here in just a moment. So one of the first items is the Crystal Cloak. If you see here, it's basically just gives her 22% physical resist, and it's enabled if it said in the tooltip enabled if casting. I wasn't sure if that's like, because the duration says infinite, so it seems like it's just something that it's just constantly going. It was a little bit tricky to tell, and obviously I can't go back and look at the footage because we were playing on a different client, but yeah, cool item for sure. Makes her tankier. She has really low armor. Obviously, she's wearing like a frozen dress here. So, having the Crystal Cloak is quite nice for giving her a little bit of buffering. Very similar principle to like Savage Orcs. So next up, we have one of her items here, which we'll pull up. It is called the Frostfang. So Frostfang basically targets an enemy. It does damage over time in kind of a little area. The tooltip might be a little bit deceiving, but basically you would click on, let's say, a unit of bloodletters. It does damage to them over time and also has a radius. So it's a little bit of an AoE targeted damage ability, which of course you guys will be seeing on the screen most likely, as well as in the battle replay, which was quite a bit of fun. So yeah, Katarin's pretty cool. She's got Lore of Ice. She has a nice item for physical resist. She has a little bit of an AoE item here. And yeah, just all around cool. We didn't get to see any like mount options or anything like that. We didn't get to see an army selection screen. So I don't know if she has other items that weren't available in this demo, but there's still a lot of stuff that could be subject to change. Obviously, we're here pretty early on. She's got about 4,000 HP, which isn't bad for a foot character. So pretty much in line with, most stuff. So that is the Tsarina. And now let us go ahead and do a deep dive here into the roster. All right, guys, and now we're here to talk about the Lore of Ice. Pretty cool for sure, and I have to say it's very refreshing to have a Lore of Magic, like I was saying, that essentially isn't dependent on summons or healing, and it's actually pretty good. At least it was in this scenario, and there's a couple things I can see for multiplayer and campaign, which are both going to be quite devastating. I definitely think it'll be very, very strong campaign at least, and decent in multiplayer. Anyways, the first spell is the Ice Maiden's Kiss. This one is very simplistic. It's a breath attack, very much like Wind Blast or, something in that light, right? It goes down. It's okay at clearing out like chaff units. It's relatively cheap in terms of Winds of Magic. And yeah, a short, wide, expanding tier-shaped attack. You guys have seen this many times. Nothing really to highlight here. Next up, we have the Ice Sheet. This one is very good. I think it's one of my favorite spells in the lore of Magic. Essentially, you put down a giant sheet of ice. Doesn't do any damage, but it does slow them by 50%, give or take 48%. We're just going to round it up to 50, which is a very powerful effect. Anytime you have snares, healing, summons, that's all really, really good stuff. And Kislev's roster has some pretty cool synergies with slowing down your opponents, right? You can really hammer them with some heavy focus fire from your guns or their thunderous, cavalry charges coming in from the Griffin Legion, as well as the Winged Lancers and the Bear Cavalry. Next up, we have the Frostblades. Frostblades is a relatively inexpensive spell. It's just your basic combat trick. It does 24 melee attack, armor piercing damage, and base damage. Can't really complain, right? That's not bad. You just put it on one of your high value units as it fights. You live long, you prosper, in the words of the great Spock. Next up, we have Death Frost. This is basically like Lore of Ice Spirit Leech. It costs more, so it's not quite a final transmutation level of damage, nor does it have AoE capabilities, at least in the one we played. But this does do direct damage. It does 1.8k damage over 27 seconds. As you can see in the tooltip there, it does indeed actually illustrate the amount of damage. So yeah, Death Frost is pretty good. It's going to be probably one of the ones you'll see more commonly in multiplayer, as it's good for sniping. And, in campaign, it's okay. But really, the later spells we're going to be getting to here are much better in the campaign. Next up, we have Crystal Sanctuary. This one is probably one of my favorite ones. It gives 66% ward save, but it does indeed snare your unit down for 35 seconds. So there's a double-edged kind of side to this, but it was actually very clutch for me. When I was playing the survival battle, we had an Exalted Bloodthirster of Khorne going after Katarin. And obviously, she's not tanky, right? She has like 6 armor, and this thing has like 800 plus weapon strength, and she was dying. So what I did is I used the Crystal Sanctuary. I got 66% ward save, and she was suddenly very tanky because she also has the item, which gives physical resist. So if you're fighting something that doesn't do, for example, magic damage, she can sit there with over 80% resistance against all damage, which is pretty crazy for sure. Well, non-magic damage, I should say. I think so. This one's going to be good. If you're about to get alpha striked, let's say, for example, somebody just unloads like a final transmutation on you, you can pop this in response and pretty much mitigate the damage very heavily. So it's quite neat. Again, it snares you for a long time, so take it with a grain of salt. I used it to pretty good effect on Katarin as well as the Elemental Bear, but it's double-edged sword. Next up is my favorite one for sure. This one is going to be a world beater in campaign. So we didn't talk too much about it earlier. It's in my other video, but basically Winds of Magic has been reworked. And how it works now is essentially instead of, getting 1 mana per 66 seconds after you've casted a bunch of magic, it's very consistent now. Essentially, Winds of Magic is going to be 1 per 10 no matter what. So every 10 seconds you're getting a Winds of Magic. So it's a little bit less than 1 per 6, which is what you start off with, but it's more consistent. Your mana pool is going to be more predictable, and it will be the 1 per 10 until you run out. So very, very cool stuff. That's the Lore of Ice there, essentially with the Heart of Winter being the last spell. This one is a progressive spell, which I think is kind of new. I don't think we've ever had anything quite like this. Basically, there's 4 phases, very similar to how Norscan Berserkers and their rage mechanic works. But if they're in the aura for 15 seconds, or the aura, or the storm, or the blizzard, the Heart of Winter, it's basically like a giant blizzard effect. It increases the slowing duration, it increases more damage over time, so it's more intense, right, the longer you're in it. And this spell can absolutely delete blobs. In multiplayer, it's going to be a little bit trickier. It does cost like 24 Winds of Magic. It's a big commitment, but if somebody does blob up in it, you could like combo this. You could use the Sheet of Ice to slow them down, or Ice Sheet, and then you could cast this, and then they're trapped in the blizzard, which is going to slow them even more. So there's some really gross, cool combos you can do with this. But that is the Lore of Ice, and that being said, let us go and look at the folks of Kislev. Pretty badass for sure. So now we're here with the roster. Now, as far as the roster goes, it was pretty apparent that when we played the demo, we didn't get to see every single unit. So I think there were a couple lower tier units that weren't in place. Essentially, as far as our melee infantry goes, one of the only ones we had access to were the Tsar Guard. So I think there are probably some lower tier infantry that will be included in the roster. So I would probably wager that this is like a good 70 to 75%, 80% of the roster, give or take. Anyways, let's begin with like the coolest unit that everybody's waiting for on the roster, which are the War Bear Riders. So there was a lot of kind of a, discussion. Are the Bear Cavalry going to be anti-infantry, or are they going to be anti-large? Well, it turned out that the Bear Cavalry are anti-large. You can look at the stat line. They have 16 models. So a little bit less than, for example, Demogryph Knights, which are rocking 24. And they have a big HP pool at 8,000. So very, very tanky, lower model count, 110 armor. So very heavily armored. I was kind of under the impression that a lot of the Kislev roster would be more lightly armored, but more mobile than the Empire. But it actually turns out they're like super heavily armored. Not as much as Demis though. You know, Demis have over 120 armor. These guys are at 110, but pretty good combat stats generally. 46 melee attack, 32 melee defense, anti-large, 110 weapon strength, and a charge bonus of 38. And of course, they do have the Kislev passive, which means when they get below half, they are going to be better at holding than Demogryph Knights, right? When Demogryph Knights get put below half HP, nothing fancy happens. With these guys, when they go below half HP, they are going to be getting that leadership buff from the Kislev faction passive. So yeah, very cool. Anti-large, armor piercing, gonna serve pretty much the same role as Demogryph Knights. Kislev doesn't seem to have healing in the traditional sense. Granted, we haven't seen its other lore magics yet. We've only seen lore Vice through Katarin. I kind of have a feeling they're not gonna have traditional healing. However, their roster, at least as far as we saw it, is not without healing. The Patriarch, the hero character who rides a bear as well, actually does have a battle prayer which heals nearby units. So he's really strong to kind of team up with the Warbear cavalry. But those are the Warbears. Pretty cool indeed. Next up, we have the Elemental Bear. Let's just go right for the goodies here. The Elemental Bear is pretty crazy. He's unbreakable, so he's kind of like this monstrous unit. He causes terror, 600 weapon strength, so he's kind of like a Dread Saurian light. He doesn't hit quite as hard as the Dread Saurian, but unlike the Dread Saurian, this bad boy is unbreakable. He also has a similar HP pool. I believe his total HP is just over 12,000. So, yeah, I mean, he doesn't hit as hard as the Dread Saurian. He has the same amount of HP. He's unbreakable, which I think instantly makes him better than the Dread Saurian. And on top of that, he has Frostbite, which is huge, right? When you have a big, King Kong, Godzilla, Kaiju battle going on, being able to snare your opponents in place is insane. So let's say, for example, the Elemental Bear goes in there, he attacks an enemy lord, chunks down a ton of HP, then suddenly, Katarin can follow up by using one of her many slowing abilities in the lore of Ice, and you can get some really crazy gooning attack slow synergies there. So the Elemental Bear, very cool, 600 weapon strength, 52 melee attack, very low melee defense at 22, which is very standard for big monsters. But the fact that he's unbreakable, has Frostbite, has great AP, I think, just makes him better than the Dread Saurian, sadly. So there is the glorious Elemental Bear, ready to fight the mighty Bloodthirster. Next up, we have the Griffin Legion. So the Griffin Legion is basically the Reiksguard Knight to the Empire Knight for this roster. So Griffin Legion are Reiksguard Knights, and then the Winged Lancers are basically like Empire Knights. You'll notice that Kislev Cavalry are pretty quick. The Griffin Legion, which are the more heavily armored variant, so you have 100 armor, 34, 30 for their combat stats, 40 weapon strength, very, very similar stat line to Reiksguard Knights. They have a charge bonus of 72, and on top of that do also have... They do have, 72 charge bonus and 75 speed is what I meant to say. Whereas Reiksguard Knights of the Empire have more armor at the expense of speed. It was just much like the predictions we were having beforehand where people were saying it's probably going to be higher charge bonus, higher speed, less armor. That's like Kislev Cavalry compared to Empire Cavalry. But, the difference of 75 speed can be a big deal in a lot of matchups. And, even in campaign, it's pretty cool. Griffin Legion, really, really cool looking model. I love it. And my Polish wife certainly loves the roster as well. Next up, we have the basic horse archers that we saw. Not, terribly exciting. It's just a skirmish cavalry unit. Okay combat stats. We have 29 and 23 for their respective combat stats. I think it was actually 28 and 22 because the tooltip I'm looking at right now did have a chevron on it from combat. But yeah, 140 range, 20 missile strength. It's just a horse cavalry unit, but they certainly have some badass mustaches and hats. Next up, we have the Ice Guard Glaives, and they're very, very similar to... let's say, I wouldn't say Sisters of Avalorn. They're kind of like Lothern Seaguard on steroids. Low armor, that's going to be their big weak point, and what might make them a little bit weaker in general, but they do have Frostbite and melee, which is nice. They also do have Frostbite with their missile attacks, so that's pretty big. Being able to shoot with your bows, obviously we do have missile attacks with poison in the game, but being able to shoot and apply Frostbite from a distance is quite cool. And in melee, they're not slouches. They don't have crazy damage output, but they do have good anti-large and armor piercing. A very... I can see them being useful maybe in matchups in which you don't want to defend your back line and you just want independent bow units. So for example, you have a front line of elite troops. You can't quite afford flank support, so you get them and they can fight off cavalry. If cavalry is trying to push into your back line, they can then shoot them with the frostbite arrows and really get some good value. On top of that, they're also immune to psychology, which I think is a pretty neat trait for sure. Next up, we do indeed have the Kossars. So the Kossars here are basic archer units. These are kind of one of the only tier 1 units that I think we got to use in battle. You can also look at the little tooltip right there, and if you see right next to their model count, you can see it says 1. That basically is telling you the tier of the unit. So that means they are a tier 1 unit, which I think is kind of a cool categorization right there. But yeah, they're basic archers. pretty okay combat stats, very similar to like dwarves in that respect, that they are like thunders or quarrelers who have like basic dwarf warrior stat lines. I think when we do get the and you can see they're actually hybrid infantry, so they're bow and axe infantry, right? So they're not bad in melee. If they have to fight like Skaven slaves or goblins, they'll be able to hold their own. 140 range, 20 missile strength, very, very basic in that respect, but certainly a cool unit. And Kislev has a lot of that. They have a ton of units that are both melee focused, like the Ice Glaive Guard, as well as the Kossars here. And my favorite, hands down, are the Streltsy, which will be coming up on here relatively soon. Also, Kossars, which we just saw, can be brought with spears. So we'll take a look at that tooltip here real quick. Again, basically turns them into budget Lothern Sea Guard. Not quite as durable, probably not quite as proficient with their bows, but again, they have anti-large and probably will be much cheaper. So those are Kossars with spears. Next up, we have Little Grom. Little Grom was something completely out of left field. I was not expecting this. So the Empire does have the Black Lions, it has war wagons, and Kislev has Little Grom. So Little Grom is an armor-piercing cannon pulled by two polar bears, which is awesome. It also is pretty good in melee, and that's something that we see for both the Kislev roster as well as the Khorne roster. The Khorne roster will, of course, be in a different video. But for Khorne, they have the Skull Cannon, which can be used in melee pretty efficiently. Little Grom is the same thing. It has 110 weapon strength, bonus first infantry, a big HP pool of 4,000, so it's almost like a relatively good single entity. On top of that, 450 range is actually really, really strong, so that outranges a lot of traditional artillery. And it does have a good missile strength at 432. Little Grom is badass for sure. It does have the wounds profile, so you'll notice that a single entity here, like we talked about earlier, does indeed have the ability to be wounded, which I think is a great change to the game. So there's Little Grom. It's a cannon being pulled by bears, and the thing is pretty cool in melee as well. Next up, we have the Streltsy, which are my favorite unit on the entire roster. Not only do I think the models are one of the coolest ones, but they have axe guns. So they're like Thunderers. They have 70 armor, very tanky, amazing leadership at 82, relatively slow at 30 speed, heavily armored, good combat stats, 28, 28, 34, and the Streltsy do also have 140 range and basically Thunderer attacks. These guys are so freaking badass, and I can't wait to play some Kislev armies just backed up with a whole legion of these guys just slow pushing, and then when the enemies get close, they draw their axes. They have 34 weapon strength with great armor piercing values. Streltsy are, I'm probably mangling so many of these names, are Streltsy, I think it's something like that, are super cool. And I do think that they're going to be a good early game unit in campaign, and also will be quite good in old multiplayer. So there you have it. Streltsy, heavily armored, definitely putting the Thunderers to shame in terms of what they bring in combat, but yeah, pretty badass unit for sure. Those are the Streltsy. And one of the last ones we have here are the Tsar Guard. So these are the elite infantry of Kislev. And in this demo, we only got to use the sword and shield variant. I'm pretty sure that we will get to have like a Tsar Guard with a great weapon and a couple of different variants, maybe some with spears, who knows. But their armor, I think, is 75. I think on this tooltip, they might have been debuffed by something. I couldn't quite remember. I think their armor is actually closer to 100, yeah, if I'm not mistaken. Because in the realm of chaos in which the screenshot was taken, it did debuff their armor. I think their armor is actually 85 or 100, so take that with a grain of salt. If you look at the top of the screen, you can see like there's a couple debuffs that Khorne gives you when you're in his realm until you capture different points. But yeah, they're heavily armored, great leadership, really good melee defense, very similar to like Marauder Champions with these sword or the axe and shield. I would probably say they're like almost identical in terms of functionality to Marauder Champions. And yeah, silver shields, great leadership. If you really want a backbone to kind of hold out, the Tsar Guard are going to be your dudes. So next up we have, yes, the last character here, which is going to be the Patriarch. So the Patriarch is very much like a warrior priest of the Empire. He has access to 2 prayers. He has a bear mount, pretty good combat stats, a little bit better in combat probably than the warrior priest, but he does have less options in terms of his prayers, but his prayers are quite good. 50 melee attack, 35 melee defense, decent combat stats, like I said, but his prayers, number 1, are Salak's Lullaby, and this one's really good. Basically, in a 40-meter range, it does heal your troops. So put him with some bear cavalry, put him in the front line with the Tsar Guard, things that really want that healing, that have a high kind of premium per HP point, and you're going to be in great shape. So that is the Salak's Lullaby. His other prayer here, let's go ahead and pull it up, is going to be Ursun's Roar. This one's okay. It gives charge bonus and leadership, so it's an okay kind of hold the line. Or if he's riding with the bear cavalry, yeah, you should pop this for sure, because getting that augmented charge bonus is quite nice. But yeah, it's quite neat. He's got the 2 prayers as far as I saw. I don't know if there's more available, but as far as we could see in the demo, he had only 2, which was the Ursun's Roar as well as the Salak's Lullaby. The healing one is going to be a staple in both campaign as well as multiplayer. I can already see just a doom stack of like 19 of these guys riding around and spamming heals and just charge bonus augmentations and just going crazy. It's going to be really fun. But that is almost it. Yes, we do have the Winged Lancers as well. Winged Lancers are the iconic unit, the Polish Hussars here. They have relatively squishy combat stats, 26, 24, only 30 weapon strength. So you can see they are basically the Empire Knight for Kislev. However, Empire Knights have a charge bonus in the 40s, and these guys have a charge bonus in the 60s. They also have 84 speed, which I think is really, really cool. It gives them a very unique flavor because they're really, really close to being skirmish cavalry with 84 speed. Not skirmish cavalry, but like light cavalry, like Reavers, but they can dominate all those other light cavalry in mobility. So if they fight Reavers in combat, they'll destroy them. If they fight Dark Riders, they'll destroy them. They have good armor, they have shields, they have a nice charge bonus, and okay combat stats. So I really love this. I think it gives Kislev its very unique flavor of not being like the Empire's heavy cavalry, but being a little bit more hit and run, a little bit more shock damage at the expense of some armor. Winged Lancers are incredibly cool units, and they were probably one of the most useful units I had in the demo we were doing. Really good at chasing down like Warhounds and fending off flanks and just all sorts of stuff like that. So that is all the units that we were shown for the Kislev roster. I'm pretty sure there are a handful more. There has to be some other basic infantry and things like that, or at least variants of the infantry we did see. But overall, I really love the roster. It feels very unique. The Kislev army is just heavy. They have a solid leadership. Very much reflects like the harshness of the North, their constant perpetual warfare with the Chaos Gods and the Chaos Wastes and just incursions. And yeah, the Lore of Ice was really fun too. I'm really looking forward to seeing how their campaign plays out. But more importantly for me, I'm really looking forward to giving them a good old college try in multiplayer. So on that note, I just want to thank you guys for joining today. There is going to be a second video going up relatively soon that will be going over the entire Khorne roster. I'll give you guys my thoughts. The Khorne roster we saw much less of. We probably only saw like 6 to 8 units, so that video will be relatively brief. And I didn't quite capture everything. There were a couple little abilities I missed here and there, so hopefully somebody got those. But if you guys did enjoy this and you're looking forward to more Warhammer 3 content, make sure to like and subscribe here on the channel. A lot of good times to come. We're going to be pretty much hitting the campaign super hard and also opening up with tournaments right away. We obviously have had the announcement of the new multiplayer game type with domination. So I think we're on with the horizon is upon us. There's going to be a new dawn here for multiplayer as well as campaign. I'm going to be just going crazy when Warhammer 3 comes out. So looking forward to taking that journey with all of you guys and having fun together. Cheers. Thanks for watching. Kislev is here, baby. Super hyped. And yeah, we'll see you guys next time. Take care.